The calloused hand trembled. Not from exhaustion, not from the 4 hours Caleb Mason had spent bent over cedar planks in the July heat. The trembling came from somewhere deeper, somewhere he'd spent 3 years learning to ignore. Nora Callahan stood in the backyard doorway, the kitchen light catching the sharp line of her jaw, her bare feet quiet on the threshold, and she looked at him with eyes that held more calculation than desperation, more deliberate courage than want. And she whispered the question that hung between them like a loaded tool belt on a nail that hadn't been tested. Am I still worth choosing? Portland hadn't cooled by 8:30. The Willamette Valley trapped summer heat the way a well-built house traps sound completely without apology, and the July air still sat at 78 degrees. Even with the sun gone, the sky bruised purple and burnt orange over the West Hills. Fireworks thundered from Tom McCall Waterfront Park 3 miles away, each concussion rolling across the rooftops of the Irvington neighborhood like something being decided. Caleb heard them without listening the way a man hears traffic after years of living on a busy street. His hands knew what they were doing. They'd known for 15 years. Western red cedar. He'd chosen it himself, called 3 suppliers before finding stock dry enough to take the finish properly, paid a little more than Ryan Callahan's budget anticipated, and absorbed the difference without mentioning it. Cedar wanted satin, not semi-gloss. Semi-gloss would brag about itself, catch every imperfection in the grain, turn a living material into something that looked manufactured. Satin let the wood stay wood. This was the kind of decision Caleb made automatically. Now the accumulated sediment of a decade and a half of building things correctly when no one was watching, which was the only way he knew how to build things. Ryan had asked him 3 weeks ago the way Ryan asked for everything casually over a beer on the existing deck that was already showing rot at the ledger board, like the request was an afterthought and not the fourth time he'd brought it up. Caleb had said he'd get to it. He'd meant it. He always meant it. He'd known since Tuesday that Ryan, Jess, and the kids were going to the waterfront show tonight, that the house would be empty, that he could finish the deck in uninterrupted quiet. He told himself the timing was purely practical. 3 weeks of scheduling around weekend soccer games and Jess's work schedule and Ryan's rotating shift had compressed his window, and a Tuesday evening with no one underfoot was simply efficient. He'd believed this explanation completely, the way a man believes the thing he most needs to believe, right up until he pulled his truck into the driveway and sat with the engine running for 2 full minutes before getting out. The previous deck had been a 16 by 12 pressure-treated afterthought, bolted to the back of the 1920s Craftsman, the wood gray and splitting the fasteners bleeding rust stains down the grain. He'd torn it out in one Saturday morning, working alone because he preferred working alone, stacking the old lumber neatly at the curb for anyone who wanted it. The new structure was cedar over a properly engineered frame. The ledger flashed correctly against the house, sheathing the footings dug below Portland's frost line, despite the fact that the Pacific Northwest barely had one. He'd done it right because doing it any other way wasn't something his hands understood. He was on the final coat when he heard the door. The voice came without announcement, without the social preamble most people use to announce themselves in someone else's space. Satin finish. Then more fully, for Western red cedar. Not a question. An assessment. The voice of someone who recognized a correct decision when they saw one. Caleb straightened his lower back, logging the complaint it had been building for the last 2 hours. He turned and found Nora Callahan standing in the doorway. He'd reframed and weather stripped last October. Ryan had mentioned the draft. Caleb had fixed it the following weekend without being asked, and she was watching him with the particular quality of attention that belongs to people who evaluate spaces for a living. She held a glass of water in her right hand. Her feet were bare. She was wearing linen pants the color of Portland fog and a white button-down with the sleeves pushed to her elbows, the kind of clothes that had started the day at an office and hadn't quite made it to actual comfort. "Correct for this wood," he said. Her eyes moved across the deck surface, not admiring, assessing. Reading the direction of the grain, the way he'd oriented the boards to drain away from the house, the spacing of the fasteners. She stepped out onto the new boards, the weight of her testing the flex, her body taking an involuntary reading of the structure beneath her feet. She found it solid. Something in the set of her shoulders acknowledged this without announcing it. Ryan had mentioned his sister. He'd mentioned her the way men mention things they don't quite know how to hold in pieces at irregular intervals when something reminded him. She'd been back 3 months. She'd gone through something with her ex. She was staying in his old bedroom. She was fine, Ryan said, the way people say fine when they mean something more complicated and don't have the specific vocabulary for it yet. What Ryan had actually said 18 months ago before any of this was that his sister didn't buy cheap materials just because they were cheaper, that she had standards and didn't apologize for them. He'd said it in the context of an argument about a contractor she'd fired on a project, someone who'd substituted inferior fasteners and thought she wouldn't notice. She'd noticed. Caleb had thought about that intermittently without meaning to. The image of a woman who could read a substitution in the hardware. They stood in the decent silence that sometimes happens between people who work with their hands and people who work with space, the silence of two professionals recognizing each other across a professional divide. Portland lit up and went dark in patterns above the West Hills as the fireworks rolled through their sequences. Ryan said, "You're in interior design," yes, he said. "Senior designer, Harlow and Associates. Flat delivery, neither modest nor promotional." A fact. "We've worked on several commercial projects in the Pearl District. I've done HVAC installations in that neighborhood." He set the brush across the can, a few of the bigger ones. She turned to look at him directly for the first time. Something passed across her face, a recalibration, the quiet arithmetic of someone realizing a connection they hadn't anticipated. She didn't name it yet. Neither did he. The fireworks were building towards something. They could hear the crowd noise faintly, the collective inhale and exhale of thousands of people watching the same sky, sharing the same involuntary awe. Caleb had taken Lily to the waterfront show 2 years running. This year, Lily was at his mother's house in Tigard, and he was here, and he had told himself all the way from Tigard back to Irvington that the timing was practical. Nora set her water glass on the new railing. The cedar took the condensation ring it would eventually leave without protest. She crossed her arms in the way of someone who has learned to occupy their own frame carefully, to take up exactly the space they intend to take up and no more. "How long have you known Ryan?" she asked. "Since we were 14. We grew up 3 blocks from each other in Selwood." He paused. "He taught me how to wire a light switch. I taught him how to pour a footing. We've been trading favors since high school." "He talks about you like you're the only person in Portland who does anything correctly." "That's because most people in Portland don't." The corner of her mouth moved. Not quite a smile, something more provisional, the reflex of amusement before the decision to allow it. It disappeared quickly. She looked back toward the fireworks sky. "Why are you here tonight?" she asked. "Ryan's not home." The question was direct enough to deserve a direct answer, and Caleb had spent enough years in other people's houses to know the difference between small talk and something else. "He's been on me for 3 weeks about finishing this. I had the time tonight." "You knew the house would be empty." He didn't answer immediately, and the pause was its own answer, not an admission of anything specific, but not a denial either. "Lily's with my mother," he said. "I didn't have anywhere to be." Nora studied him with the focused neutrality of someone who reads rooms for a living. He let her. He was used to being read and found competent, and that was generally enough for most people. "Tell me about your ex-wife," she said. It was the kind of question that comes in 2 varieties, the social lubricant version asked with a specific lean that invites a carefully abbreviated answer, and the real version asked straight without performance by someone who actually wants to know. This was the real version. He recognized it because he'd heard the social lubricant version 100 times at Ryan's barbecues over 3 years, and had deflected it with equal ease every time. He picked up a clean round and wiped the brush he'd set down, buying himself the 2 seconds he needed to decide whether to give her the real version back. He decided. "She said I was too safe, too predictable." The words had lost most of their weight with repetition, but not all of it. Some things kept an edge no matter how many times you handled them. "She said living with me was like being anchored at the bottom of the ocean, that I was the weight keeping her from surfacing." Nora didn't offer a condolence. She waited. She'd been having an affair with someone from her CrossFit gym, someone who apparently made her feel like she was surfacing. He folded the rag over once. "I found out and we were done. Lily was 4. "When was this? 3 years ago. July." He looked up. About this time of year, she absorbed this. Not with the performance of sympathy, the head tilt, the softened eyes, the "I'm so sorry" that people offered when they wanted to acknowledge pain, without getting too close to it, but with the stillness of someone sitting with information and letting it register at full weight. Marcus said I was like assembling IKEA furniture, she said. Her voice was level the way a structural report is level, all the damage documented without inflection. He said I had all the right pieces but no warmth. That being with me felt like a project that looked finished but never actually worked. Caleb set the rag down. He said that to you. He said variations of it regularly. A pause. He framed it as an explanation for why he needed to be patient with me. Why I needed him specifically, because he understood how to make the pieces work when I couldn't. The fireworks were doing something elaborate overhead, a sequence of gold that kept opening into wider gold. Caleb looked at the patterns and thought about what he'd just heard with the same part of his brain he used to read load calculations, finding the structural problem beneath the surface presentation. How long were you together? 2 years. I moved back here 4 months ago. She uncrossed her arms and then crossed them again, a small, restless adjustment. He didn't raise his voice. He never did anything that looked like what it was from the outside. He just gradually replaced my perspective with his one small correction at a time until I couldn't tell which thoughts were mine and which ones he'd installed. And the painting, Caleb said. She looked at him sharply. He hadn't framed it as a question. Ryan mentioned you painted, he said. Past tense, that you used to. Something shifted in her face, a kind of careful inward movement, the way a door closes without slamming. Marcus thought it was a phase. He said it nicely. He said it wasn't serious work, that I was building a real career and serious people didn't divide their energy. He said it so consistently for so long that eventually I started saying it to myself. Her jaw tightened. I haven't picked up a brush in 18 months. Caleb stood very still. He understood in the specific and bone-deep way that one craftsman understands another's relationship to their work, what 18 months of not using the most honest part of yourself felt like from the inside. He'd gone 4 months after Diane left before he went back to the workshop. He knew what that vacancy felt like. You want to know why I said no, he said. Not a question. Nora had gone very still beside him. She hadn't said anything about saying no. She hadn't made any move. But the air between them had changed in the previous 10 minutes by increments too small to name individually and too significant collectively to pretend didn't exist. Thus, she looked at him. I haven't asked you anything. Not yet. The fireworks finale was beginning, the compressed percussion of 12 bursts in rapid sequence. The sky over the West Hills becoming briefly and extravagantly lit. In the light, he could see her clearly. The shadows under her eyes, that careful concealer, hadn't quite covered. The tension in her jaw that came from longer than 4 months. The way she was watching him with an expression he recognized because he'd worn it himself. The expression of someone standing at the edge of a bad decision they know is a bad decision and are still being pulled toward by the gravitational weight of loneliness, which is one of the heaviest forces there is. The direct question, when it came quietly with both hands. She stepped forward 1 step and placed her palms against his chest over his sternum, and she looked up at him with the specific, focused courage of a woman who has decided that asking is less terrifying than not knowing. And she asked, am I still worth choosing? He didn't answer immediately. This was not hesitation from indecision. It was the pause of a man standing at the exact point where wanting something and doing what's right with that wanting diverge into 2 separate directions, and understanding precisely which road leads where and choosing the harder one anyway. His hands came up and wrapped around her wrists, not pushing, just holding. Her pulse was fast under his fingers, or maybe that was his own pulse reflected back through the point of contact. Not like this, he said. His voice came out lower than he intended, rougher. Not for this reason. She didn't pull away. What reason? Because I've been where you're standing. He kept his voice steady because she needed him to be steady, not because steadiness was what he was feeling. After Diane left the first 6 months, I did what you're thinking about doing. I found people to prove I wasn't as broken as she'd said. I want you to understand something about how that went. He paused. It made every single thing worse. Not because anything was wrong with them, because I was using them like a structural element I hadn't designed for, and putting weight on something that isn't designed to carry weight breaks everything. Her hands were still on his chest, not pressing, just present. The warmth of her palms through his shirt was something he was actively not allowing himself to process. "You don't know me well enough to know what I need," she said. "No, but I know this specific thing. I know it from inside." He looked at her directly. "You came out here tonight not because you want me. You came out here because you want to know if the part of you that got dismantled is still in there somewhere. That's a real and legitimate thing to want to know. But I'm not the right way to find out. And 3 months from now, you'd know that, and knowing it would cost you something you can't get back." She was quiet for long enough that the finale finished, and the sky went back to ordinary dark, and the crowd noise from the waterfront dispersed, and Portland settled into the particular quiet of a summer holiday winding down. When she finally spoke, her voice had the controlled quality she used professionally, the one that could discuss structural problems without structural emotion. "He told me I was like IKEA furniture because he needed me to believe I required assembly, that I was incomplete without the specific way he understood me." A pause that cost her something. "I have spent 4 months trying to figure out if he was right." He wasn't right. The certainty in Caleb's voice was the same certainty he used to tell clients their foundation was compromised. Not comfortable, but not debatable. He was strategic. There's a difference. How do you know the difference from the outside? Because a person who genuinely sees something incomplete in you doesn't keep you close. They leave. He stayed for 2 years with a woman he claimed was unfinished. That's not a diagnosis. That's a preference. He let her absorb that. He needed you to be a project because projects require curators. He wanted to be the only person who knew how to read you. Her eyes changed. Not dramatically, a small interior shift, like a door opening inward rather than slamming outward. Something he'd said had landed somewhere real. He released her wrists gently and stepped back, giving her air. She wrapped her arms back around herself. The gold porch light from next door caught the angle of her face. "You're not broken," he said. "I need you to hear that as a statement of observation, not encouragement. I'm not saying it to make you feel better. I'm saying it because I'm looking at you and it's accurate." She almost laughed, not dismissively, but in the involuntary way that happens when something true catches you sideways. "You don't know me. I know what broken looks like. I've seen it in my own mirror." He paused. "You came out here, took a real risk, said a difficult thing directly. Broken people don't do that. Broken people go very still and wait for the danger to pass." She looked at him for a long moment, 10 seconds, maybe 12, which is a long time to hold someone's eyes without speaking. Then she reached down and picked up her water glass from the railing. She looked at the wet ring the condensation had left on the cedar. "Cedar takes rings," he said. "It's part of the wood, doesn't compromise the structure." She nodded once. She walked back to the door and pushed it open and went inside without looking back. The kitchen light swallowed her and the door swung closed behind her, and Caleb Mason stood alone on the new deck in the dark and listened to the last of the July 4th sound dissolve over the West Hills and didn't move for a while. He'd done the right thing. He understood clearly that he'd done the right thing. This clarity did not make standing there alone on the dark deck any easier, and he had enough integrity not to pretend otherwise, at least to himself. He packed up his tools slowly. The methodical sequence of cleaning and organizing equipment was one of the things he used to bring himself back to the present tense. He'd learned this in the workshop in the worst months after Diane, and the habit had become load-bearing. He washed the brush in the utility sink on the side of the house. He wrapped the can. He carried his toolbox to the truck and stowed it behind the seat. His phone buzzed when he was pulling out of the driveway. Ryan's name on the screen. He answered before the second ring. "Hey man, just got back and walked around the deck. Seriously, you outdid yourself." Jess keeps running her hand along the boards. Ryan sounded like a man who had eaten good food and watched good fireworks and had no complications in his life at that moment, which was exactly how his voice should sound. "We owe you a real dinner for this one. You and Lily next week sometime." "Sounds good." Caleb kept his voice even. "Glad it came out right. You okay? You sound weird." "Long day, good tired. Get some sleep, and seriously beautiful work." After they hung up, Caleb sat in the truck in the Irvington street without starting the engine for 2 full minutes. He listened to the neighborhood settle. A dog barked twice on the next block. Someone's sprinkler system clicked on. The ordinary texture of a city that didn't know or care what had happened in that backyard. Ryan was his best friend. He was the person Caleb called when the hot water heater at the rental unit failed at 10 on a Friday night, and the person who'd shown up at the hospital when Lily had croup, and Caleb hadn't had anyone else to call at 2 in the morning, and the person who'd sat with him on the Selwood Bridge at noon on a Wednesday 6 months after Diane left, and just been there, not talking, not offering solutions, just a physical presence that communicated that the world still contained people who gave a damn. Nora was Ryan's sister. She was 28 years old and 3 months out of a relationship that had spent 2 years systematically dismantling her trust in her own perception, and she was sleeping in her childhood bedroom while she tried to remember who she was before someone else decided for her. She was not an available person. She was a person who thought she was available and did not yet understand the difference. Caleb started the truck and drove home. His house was a 1920s bungalow in the Woodstock neighborhood, 4 miles from Ryan's place. 2 bedrooms and a sleeping porch. He'd converted to a proper room for Lily over the course of one very cold February. He'd bought it 3 months after Diane left specifically because it needed work. 3 years later, he'd fixed most of what was fixable and improved most of what could be improved, the kitchen, the bathroom with subway tile. He'd laid himself every room painted in colors Lily had helped choose. He sat in the garage for a long time after he got home. He wasn't working. He sat on the stool near the workbench and drank a cup of coffee that went cold while he thought about things he was trying not to think about. He thought about Nora saying she'd spent 4 months trying to determine whether a man who needed her to be a project had been right about her incompleteness. He thought about the 18 months without painting. He thought about the water glass condensation ring on the cedar and what he'd told her that cedar takes rings, that it's part of the wood, that it doesn't compromise the structure. He hoped that was true about more than wood. He did not sleep for another 2 hours. When he finally did, he dreamed about nothing, which was the best he could usually manage, and which was enough. Part 2. The Maple Street Diner had been serving the same breakfast menu since 1987, and Linda Pierce had been working the morning shift there for 19 of those years, which meant she had developed a functional taxonomy of the people who came through the door before 7 a.m. She knew which category a person belonged to within 30 seconds of walking through the door, and she acted accordingly. More coffee, less conversation. The particular gift of experienced diner staff who understand that presence and invisibility are sometimes the same service. Caleb Mason was in his usual booth by the window at 6:03, second cup already in front of him. Linda had placed it there without being asked because she knew the difference between his regular Tuesday coffee face and whatever this was. This was the second cup before 6 face. She left him alone. At 6:17, the door opened, and Linda looked up from the counter and did a thing she almost never did, which was look twice. The woman who walked in was put together in the way that people are put together when they've made a deliberate effort to appear put together and haven't quite closed the distance, hair pulled back with careful precision, good clothes chosen correctly, the particular posture of someone who moves through professional spaces and has learned to carry their body like a credential. But Linda had 19 years of reading people at 6 in the morning, and what she saw underneath the presentation was someone who had been awake since at least 3. The woman stopped just inside the door and looked across the diner and found Caleb's booth, and something passed between them that Linda couldn't have named, but recognized the specific quality of two people who have already had the conversation that mattered and are now figuring out whether to have the next one. Linda picked up the coffee pot. Nora Callahan slid into the booth across from Caleb without asking, because the asking was already done, had been done somewhere before this morning in a way that made the formality unnecessary. She wrapped both hands around the mug Linda set in front of her and looked out the window at the empty street where Portland was just beginning to remember it was a city. A delivery truck moved through the intersection. A man in running clothes crossed against the light. "I couldn't sleep," she said. Neither could I. She turned the mug a quarter turn, then back. "I kept thinking about what you said, about the 6 months after your wife left." A pause that had weight in it. "You were honest with me about that before I asked you to be. Most people wouldn't have been. Most people are managing their own comfort when they think they're being kind." Her eyes came up to his face. "Is that what you were doing on the deck, being honest instead of kind?" "I was trying to do both." He looked at her steadily. "I don't think they're actually in opposition most of the time. I think we've been taught they are because honesty is harder to deliver and easier to avoid. She was quiet for a moment in the way of someone turning a statement over, checking its underside. Marcus was never honest with me. He was kind constantly, considerate, patient in ways that I kept thinking meant something kept thinking indicated depth. The words came out with the flat affect of someone who has processed the facts and is still working on the feelings. I understand now that the patience was strategic, that a person who is genuinely patient doesn't need to remind you of it. The kindness that comes with an audience, Caleb said, is always performing something. She looked at him. He performed devotion, consistently. In public with my family, with colleagues. My brother liked him. She set the mug down. Ryan actually introduced us at a firm event 2 years ago. He thought we were a good match. This was new information and Caleb absorbed it without reacting visibly, though the implications settled in his chest with some weight. Ryan had been carrying that, probably without talking about it in the private accounting that people keep when they believe they owe a debt they can't directly repay. Ryan didn't know, Caleb said. Nobody knew. That was part of the design. She turned the mug again, the small repetitive motion of someone whose hands needed something to do. He was very good at being one person in public and a slightly different person in private. Not dramatically different, there was no switch. Just a sustained, low-level pressure over time, like water, finding the path of least resistance through stone. By the time I felt the erosion, the channel was already cut. What did it feel like when you realized it? She thought about this honestly, rather than answering quickly, which he was coming to understand was characteristic of her, the refusal to offer a response until she'd verified it was accurate. Like waking up in a room and not recognizing the furniture. Everything looked familiar. Everything was technically mine, but I couldn't remember choosing any of it. Outside, a woman walked past the window with a golden retriever who was very interested in the diner's foundation. The ordinary mechanics of a Portland summer morning continued without concern for anyone's internal weather. Tell me about the painting, Caleb said. Not a request for the story she'd already told him. He wanted the part underneath the facts. She considered him across the table, deciding whether he was asking because it was relevant or because he was curious. He let her take the time. My mother is a retired elementary school teacher. She began, and her voice changed, not softer exactly, but less defended, the way at a room sounds different when you take down the acoustic tile and find the original plaster underneath. She taught second grade in Eugene for 31 years. She is one of those people who pay close attention to children without making children feel observed, which is a rare skill. A pause. When I was 8, I showed her something I'd painted. I don't even remember what something with flowers, probably the kind of thing an 8-year-old paints. And instead of saying it was beautiful or that I was talented, she looked at it for a long time and said, "This has something in it." Not a compliment, an observation. Her jaw shifted slightly. I built a compass out of that sentence. I spent 20 years trying to make things that had something in them. And Marcus said that compass pointed the wrong direction. Marcus said the compass was a hobby, that the professional work, the design work, the commercial projects, the career he said he was proud of me for building, that was the real thing. And the painting was what you did on weekends when you needed to decompress, not a thing you organized your life around. Her hands tightened on the mug. He said it so many times so reasonably that I started hearing it in my own voice, started saying it to myself. And then I stopped painting because I was saying it to myself and believing it, and the stopping felt like maturity, like I'd graduated past a juvenile attachment. He took the one thing that told you who you were, Caleb said. She looked at the table. I let him. You were inside it while it was happening. You can't see the shape of something when you're standing in the middle of it. He leaned forward slightly, forearms on the table. I spent 7 years making myself smaller inside my marriage. And I told myself it was compromise. I told myself that what looked like erasure was actually partnership. I couldn't see what it was until I was standing outside it, and even then it took me another year. She looked up. What did it take to see it clearly? Lily. The answer came without hesitation. Lily needed me to be a specific person, not a better person than I was, not a different person, exactly the person I actually was, and she needed that consistently without me disappearing into someone else's idea of who I should be. Taking care of her required me to be present in myself in a way I hadn't been in years. He paused. She didn't fix anything. She just made the work unavoidable. Linda came by with a coffee pot, refilled both mugs without ceremony, and departed. Neither of them acknowledged this. It was service performed at exactly the right level of invisibility. "What do I do?" Nora asked, "with 18 months of not painting?" "You go buy paint today." She looked at him, not metaphorically, literally. "There's a Blick Art Materials on Southwest 10th, 10 minutes from here." He picked up his coffee. "You go in, you buy a canvas, and whatever you need, you go home, and you put the canvas somewhere you'll see it. You don't have to paint today, you just have to make painting possible today." That sounds too simple. The first step of any job is making the job possible to do. You clear the work area, you get the materials. You don't start building before the site is ready. He set the mug down. "You've been trying to feel ready to paint before giving yourself anything to paint with. That's not how readiness works. It comes after the first stroke, not before." Something crossed her face that wasn't quite hope, but belonged to the same family, more like the moment when a structural problem has been correctly diagnosed and the path to repair becomes imaginable, even if the repair itself is still ahead. "And the not trusting my own judgment," she said. "When I reach for a preference, I hit this gap where I'm not sure if I want the thing or if I just got accustomed to wanting it because he wanted it." "What do you drink in the morning?" She blinked. "Coffee." "Did you drink coffee before Marcus?" "Since college." "So that one's yours." He held her gaze. "Start there, find the things that predate him. They're still in there, not gone, just buried under 2 years of someone else's editorial decisions. You excavate carefully. You don't rush the site." Their food arrived, eggs and wheat toast for him, pancakes for her, she'd ordered, without looking at the menu, which meant this diner was already part of her geography of the neighborhood she'd grown up in and returned to. They ate in the comfortable silence of people who have already said something real to each other and don't need to fill the space that follows with performance. "Tell me something," she said halfway through the pancakes. "The night on the deck, when I asked you what I asked you, you stood there for a moment before you answered." Her voice was careful, precise. "I want to know what was happening in that moment." He looked at her. "I was deciding. Between. Between the thing I wanted to do and the thing that was right." He held her eyes. "I want you to understand that those were genuinely separate options. I'm not telling you it was easy to choose the second one because it wasn't. I'm telling you I chose it anyway." She sat with this. He watched her process it the way it confirmed something she'd suspected but hadn't been able to trust. "Why does it matter that it was hard?" she asked. "Because easy choices don't cost anything. A man who does the right thing because it's easy hasn't actually told you anything about himself. A man who does it when it costs him something, that's information." Her expression shifted in a way that was small and significant. She looked back at her plate. "I think I've been telling myself it was simple," she said, "that you just assessed the situation and made the reasonable decision. It's easier to believe that." "Why easier?" "Because if it cost you something, then there's something between us that I don't have a framework for yet." A pause. "And I'm not currently in a position to trust my own frameworks." "There's something here," he said. "I'm not going to pretend otherwise because that would be another version of managing my own comfort at your expense. But I'm also not going to do anything about it right now, and neither should you, and that's not me being noble. It's me being accurate about what's actually possible versus what just feels possible." She nodded slowly, the nod of someone who has received information that is both disappointing and clarifying. "Friends," she said. "Yes," he paused. "Real ones. Not the kind where that word is a placeholder for something else." She looked at him, measuring. "Then real ones." Something settled in her face, the acceptance of a structure that was sound, even if it wasn't the one she'd initially reached for. They paid separately. Outside on the sidewalk, the morning heat was already suggesting what the afternoon would deliver, and Nora put her sunglasses on and looked down Maple Street and said she had a client call at 9 that she needed to prepare for. He said he had a service call in Lake Oswego at 8. They walked in opposite directions to their cars, and that was the whole of it, and it was enough. The canvas appeared in the photo Ryan texted him 4 days later. Not a painting, just the canvas leaning against the wall of Nora's room, with the plastic wrapper still on it. Ryan hadn't taken the photo deliberately. It was in the background of a picture of his youngest demonstrating a handstand. Caleb stared at the canvas in the background for longer than the handstand warranted. By the following Tuesday, the rapper was off. He knew this because Nora called him at 10 p.m. Not a scheduled thing, not preceded by a text asking if he was available, just a call, and he answered it from the garage workbench where he was dry fitting the oak joints for Lily's bookshelves. If I told you that looking at a blank canvas feels like standing at the edge of a very tall thing, Madame, she said without preamble, what would you tell me to do with that feeling? He set down the piece of oak in his hand. I'd tell you that the feeling is accurate and irrelevant. Explain. The height is real. The thing you are about to do is actually significant and actually difficult, and the part of you that's scared about it is correctly reading the situation. He picked up a different piece, checked the grain. But significance and difficulty are not reasons to stay on the ground. They're descriptions of what you're about to do. The only actual question is whether you step off. A pause that had texture to it. You make it sound simple. I said the question was simple. I didn't say the step was. Another pause. When you were in the garage the first time after your wife left and you finally drove a nail, what was the actual thing that moved your hand? He thought about this honestly. He thought about the specific afternoon in February Lily at preschool, the workshop cold enough that his breath showed the hammer in his hand feeling like an object he'd borrowed from someone else's life. I thought about Lily needing somewhere to put her books, he said. That's it. Not a principle, not a decision about healing. Just she has books and nowhere to put them. So I started building somewhere to put them. Something specific. Something outside yourself. Something outside yourself, he confirmed. The feeling doesn't have to be gone. You just need something more immediate than the feeling. She was quiet for a moment. Then, okay. He heard the sound of movement, the shift of someone reaching for something. He went back to the oak joints with something lighter in his chest than what had been there an hour ago. The calls became a pattern, not nightly, not scheduled, but regular in the way of things that have found their own frequency. She called when she was stuck, and he talked her through it without giving her the answer, asking the questions that led her toward her own. He called when a job went sideways and needed to be thought through out loud, and she asked precise questions that had a way of locating the actual problem beneath the presenting problem. On the 10th day after the diner, she sent him a photo of the canvas. Not a message, just the image. He looked at it for a long time. It wasn't representational dark at the center, with the beginnings of light at the edges, neither finished nor abandoned. It was the kind of early work that looked uncertain from the outside and meant everything from the inside. He texted back, "Cedar takes rings, keep going." Her response came in 30 seconds. "That's not a sentence about painting." "It is, though," he wrote, and put his phone away. The second week of July became the third. Portland climbed into the high 80s and stayed there, and Caleb worked his way through a backlog of service calls, residential, HV, AC units, struggling with the load they weren't designed for. He was good at this, and he was known for being good at this, and the referrals came in at a rate that had been making him reconsider for the fourth consecutive year whether it was time to stop being a one-man operation. Ryan had been telling him for 2 years to start a company. "You're the best HVAC tech in this city, and you're charging like you're not," Ryan had said more than once. "You could have 4 guys working for you and still have more work than you could handle." Caleb always had a reason it wasn't the right time. The reasons were all technically true and collectively insufficient, and he knew it. The Marcus situation arrived on a Friday in the third week of July without warning. Ryan opened the front door of his house at 6:15 in the evening because someone rang the bell, and the person standing on the porch was a man in a slate gray blazer holding flowers from Trader Joe's. Ryan, who knew the name but not the full story, stepped back and let him in because there wasn't yet a reason not to. Nora was upstairs. She heard the voice before she processed it. Her nervous system logged it first, a cold drop in her stomach before her conscious mind named the source. She moved to the top of the stairs and looked down through the railing and saw Marcus standing in the living room she'd grown up in, talking to her brother with the easy professional warmth that she now understood was always a performance. Her first instinct was the oldest one: go down there and manage it, keep things smooth, translate the situation into something no one needed to be uncomfortable about. She recognized the instinct. She did not follow it. She went back to her room and sent Caleb a text. Marcus is downstairs. Ryan let him in. I don't know what to do. His call came in 40 seconds. You heard me. His voice was level, the voice he used when something needed to be handled correctly, and emotion was a variable to work around rather than through. You don't need me to drive over there. I know. She was standing in the middle of her room, facing the canvas she'd been working on all week, the half-finished figure reaching into the upper right corner. But I don't know what to say to him. Yes, you do. No pause, no softening. You know exactly what you want to say. You don't trust yourself to say it yet. Those are different problems. She looked at the reaching figure on the canvas. What if I go down there and I just revert? What if being in the same room with him makes me go back to being the person I was when I was with him? That person knew something was wrong and stayed anyway, Caleb said. That person isn't who you're describing. Give her more credit. The silence on the line was different from other silences. She could hear him set something down, understood without being told that he was giving her the full quality of his attention. This was what he did. He didn't announce that he was present. He simply was. Tell me what you want to say to him, he said. Not what you think you should say, what you actually want to say. She thought about it. Really thought about it, standing in front of the canvas with his voice in her ear. I want to say that he doesn't have the right to be in this house. That whatever he thinks a conversation would accomplish, I'm done accepting his version of who I am. That's exactly what you should say. That's the whole thing. That's the whole thing. You don't owe him the labor of helping him understand why you're done. You just tell him the truth and let the door do the rest. She was quiet. Down below, she could hear the murmur of conversation, Ryan's voice, and then Marcus's, and the ordinary social choreography of a living room that didn't know it contained something toxic. Stay on the line, she said. I'm not going anywhere. She walked down the stairs. The conversation paused when she appeared at the bottom, and she registered the particular adjustment Marcus made the shift into the version of himself he presented to her, the careful warmth and the slightly furrowed concern, the performance of a man who has reflected deeply and come in good faith. She didn't let him get to whatever he'd prepared. She told him calmly and completely what she'd said to Caleb upstairs. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need Ryan to intervene, though she could see him recalibrating behind Marcus's shoulder, filling in the blanks of the story he had only half been told. She said what she meant, and when Marcus opened his mouth to reframe, she said, "The door's right there." And that was the end of it. The door closed. Ryan stood in the living room looking at his sister with an expression she recognized as the specific combination of guilt and relief and retroactive anger that belongs to someone who's just had the full picture handed to them. She walked back upstairs. The phone was still in her hand, the line still open. "You still there?" she said. "Still here. I did it. I know." A pause. "How do you feel?" She stood in front of the canvas, the reaching figure, the arm extended at the angle that knew where it was going. She picked up a brush from the table beside it and turned it over in her fingers. "Like I want to paint," she said. She heard something in the quality of his silence that she couldn't name but that registered as important. "Then paint," he said. She painted for 5 hours. The figure resolved into something clear. The light in the upper right corner became specific rather than suggested. At 11:15, she took a photo and sent it to him with no message, and he responded at 11:22 with a single word, "Yes." She didn't ask what he meant. She already knew. 2 weeks later, on a Wednesday evening after the day's heat had finally released its grip on the city, Ryan Callahan took 2 beers from the refrigerator and carried them out to the new deck and set one in front of Caleb and opened his own and looked out at the backyard where the string lights were doing their work in the dusk. "I talked to Nora," Ryan said. Caleb took a drink and said nothing. He'd learned over 18 years that Ryan moved toward the thing he actually wanted to say at his own pace, and rushing him produced worse results than waiting. "She told me what Marcus was doing." Ryan's voice had a quality Caleb recognized, the particular flatness of a man who has received information that made him feel several things simultaneously and is refusing to perform any of them. "The whole thing. She hadn't told me before because she was still figuring out what it actually was." A pause. "I introduced them." "You didn't know?" "No." Ryan turned the can in his hands. "But I also didn't ask the right questions. I saw the surface and thought I was seeing the thing." He was quiet for a moment. Jess tried to tell me something was off, maybe 8 months into it. Said Nora seemed smaller when Marcus was around. I told her she was misreading the dynamic. He took a drink. Jess doesn't misread dynamics. Caleb looked out at the backyard. 2 houses down, someone was running a sprinkler in the cooling evening. How is she? He asked. Ryan turned to look at him. The look was direct and fully informed, and had been building for a few weeks, Caleb suspected. She's painting again, Ryan said. She's been painting all day, every day, for 2 weeks, and she seems more like herself than she has in 2 years. He paused. She talks about you. Caleb held the beer and didn't answer. She doesn't talk about you the way you talk about a person who did you a favor, Ryan said. She talks about you the way Jess used to talk about me before we were us. He looked at Caleb directly. You understand what I'm telling you? I understand. I'm not saying no. Ryan set his can down on the cedar railing. I'm saying I need you to look me in the eyes and tell me you understand what's at stake. Not just what you could lose, what I could lose. If I'm wrong about this, Caleb said, if we try and it fails, you're the one who can't escape the wreckage. You're in the middle of both of us. That's real, and I know it's real. And I don't have a solution for it. I can't guarantee I'm right. He held Ryan's eyes. What I can tell you is that the night she came out on the deck and asked me something she shouldn't have asked, I said no. Not because I didn't want to, because it wasn't right for her, and her being all right mattered more to me than what I wanted in that moment. Ryan was quiet for a long beat. I'm not asking you for anything tonight, Caleb said. I'm telling you what's true, which is something you're owed. When something is actually happening, you'll hear it from me first, before anyone else. Ryan picked up his beer. He looked out at the backyard, the string lights, the new cedar boards, the ordinary summer evening in a city they'd both grown up in. Then he said, open the company, Caleb. You're the best AC tech in this city, and you're the only person who hasn't figured that out yet. They sat on the deck until the string lights were the brightest thing in the yard, talking about other things, Ryan's youngest starting kindergarten, a timbers game, a rental property Ryan was considering. The weight between them shifted into something more load-bearing than before, the kind of structure that could hold what was coming. Part 3. The week Ryan and Jess drove to Florida began on a Sunday with a phone call from Sarasota and ended for practical purposes with a key under the front mat and a handwritten list of instructions about the mail and the plants taped to the inside of the kitchen cabinet. Jess's mother had fallen in the parking lot of a Publix, a hairline fracture in the left hip, the kind of injury that isn't immediately dangerous and isn't immediately fine, and requires the presence of people who love you to navigate correctly. Ryan loaded the minivan with the focused efficiency of a man who had been a homeowner and father long enough to pack for a week-long absence in 40 minutes, and then the driveway was empty and the house on Wisteria Avenue was quiet in a new way. Nora stayed because she had a gallery show in 5 weeks, and because Portland in late July was where her work was, and because the room upstairs had become a studio in the way that spaces become what they need to become when someone is doing real work in them. The smell of linseed oil and acrylic medium had migrated into the hallway. Canvas boards were stacked along one wall in a system that looked random and was actually chronological, and the north-facing window that Ryan had always found useless threw exactly the quality of light she needed in the afternoon hours. She was not going to leave that light. Caleb came by the first evening with Lily, who was 7 years old, and had opinions about puppies, houseplants, and the structural integrity of couch cushion forts that she shared without being asked. He checked the locks on the back door, which Ryan had mentioned stuck since spring, and fixed the mechanism in 12 minutes with a screwdriver and a tube of graphite lubricant from his truck. Nora watched him do this from the kitchen doorway, the efficient economy of it, the way he diagnosed the problem by feel before he looked at it. Lily discovered the canvas boards when Nora was making iced tea in the kitchen, and the 7-year-old's assessment was immediate and total. This one is sad, she announced, holding up an early piece, the dark center, the closed-in forms. But this one is trying. She held up a middle piece, and this one knows something. She held up the reaching figure, which was nearly finished. Now the arm extended at its particular angle into the upper right light. Nora stood in the kitchen doorway, holding 2 glasses of iced tea, and looked at Caleb, who was looking at his daughter with the private pride of a man who understood that he had built something remarkable in this child and knew better than to say so out loud. Those first evenings established the pattern of the week without anyone deciding on a pattern. Caleb arrived between 6 and 7, sometimes with Lily, and sometimes alone on the nights his mother had her, and the house felt different with his presence in it, quieter in one register and louder in another. The ambient awareness of another adult in the space turned up in a way Nora noticed and did not examine directly. They talked on the back porch while the Portland summer finished its long work of staying light. They talked about Ryan's childhood fear of electrical current extraordinary, given that he became an electrician, and about Jess's mother who was reportedly running the hospital floor from her bed. They talked about the commercial project Nora was finishing in the Pearl District, a restaurant build-out where the owner had changed his mind about the bar placement 3 times and each change required rerouting the plumbing behind the walls. And Caleb had opinions about this from the HVAC side that were both technically correct and sympathetically delivered. On Thursday night, Lily fell asleep on the living room couch at 9. The movie she'd been watching finished its credits, and they turned it off and sat in the specific quiet of a house where a child was sleeping, a quality of silence that had a different texture than regular silence, something more like permission. Nora's question came from the place where the real questions come from, bypassing the internal filter that usually catches things before they become words. Do you ever worry you'll become what Diane said you were? Her voice was quiet, genuinely curious. Not that she was right, but that you'll internalize the verdict enough that it starts to run you. He looked at her across the couch, Lily's breathing the only sound between them. Every time I meet someone, he said, every time there's a moment where I could reach for something and don't. There's a voice that says, see, she was right, you're not capable of it. You go still when you should move. A pause. I've spent 3 years arguing with that voice by building things that work, proving it wrong through results rather than through argument, because you can't argue a feeling into submission. But you go still anyway, she said. Not an accusation. Sometimes going still is the right thing. He looked at her steadily. Not always, but sometimes the stillness is structural, not failure. Sometimes you're not moving because you've correctly assessed that moving now would damage something that isn't ready to bear weight yet. She turned this over with the deliberateness he'd come to recognize as her most honest mode. How do you know the difference? You don't always, he said. That's the honest answer. You make the call with the information you have, and you find out later if you were right. He paused. The nights I've doubted this particular stillness, I've thought about what you told me, that you spent 2 years with someone who moved fast and decided everything. And I've thought slow is not the same as wrong. No, she said, her voice carrying something that wasn't quite relief but belonged to the same family. It isn't. Lily shifted on the couch, resettled without waking, her arm dropping off the edge in the absolute boneless trust of a sleeping child. Nora looked at her for a moment, not with the performed softness that people sometimes apply to other people's children, but with something more direct, the expression of someone seeing a specific person and responding to what was actually there. She told me this afternoon that she thinks the reaching figure in my painting is looking for something it already knows exists, Nora said. 7 years old. She said something similar to me about the bookshelf I built her. He looked at his daughter. She said it looked like I built it to last, not just to hold things. I asked her how she knew the difference, and she said you can tell by how careful someone was. He was quiet for a moment. I don't know where she gets it. You toy, Nora said, simply without elaboration. He didn't answer because there wasn't an answer that wouldn't have led somewhere neither of them had agreed to go yet. He carried Lily to the truck at 10:30. Nora stood on the front porch in the warm dark and watched them pull away, then went back upstairs and painted for 2 hours before the work told her it was done for the night. The following evening was the last before Ryan and Jess came home and Caleb came alone. He walked through the house in his systematic way, checking windows and testing the fixed back door. And when he came into the kitchen, Nora was pouring 2 glasses of water because the iced tea was gone and water was what there was. Their fingers touched in the exchange, her handing him the glass, his taking it, the contact brief, and entirely accidental and absolutely unambiguous to both of them about what it was carrying. Neither said anything. She went to stand at the window over the sink, where the neighbor's garden was visible in the dusk, the late July dahlias at their full ridiculous height. There's something I need to say before Ryan comes home, she said. She was still facing the window, which he understood was not evasion, but the particular position some people needed for hard honesty, a slightly sideways posture, a way of saying something true without the full exposure of saying it directly into the other person's face. He waited. I told you there was something here. She turned then because she was Nora Callahan, and she finished things she started, and she was not going to deliver this one sideways after all. I've been waiting to say the rest of it until I was sure I was saying it from the right place, until I was sure it wasn't fear or loneliness or the rebound mechanics that I know are real and that I've been watching for in myself. She held his eyes. I'm sure now. Nora. His voice had a warning in it, not toward her, but toward himself, toward the part of him paying very close attention and needing to hear the rest before doing anything with it. I'm not asking you for anything tonight, she said. I know what tonight is, and I know what still needs to happen first. I'm just telling you that when you talk to Ryan, because you're going to, I want you to know that whatever you tell him is true. This isn't a misread. A pause. What I feel is real, and I wanted you to walk into that conversation knowing that. He set his water glass down on the counter with care. How long have you known since the diner? She didn't hesitate. I knew on the deck that there was something. I knew in the diner that it was specific. I've spent 6 weeks verifying that the knowing was mine and not a story I'd assembled from available materials. Something moved across her face, the self-awareness that had learned to coexist with difficulty. I've become very careful about which thoughts are mine. That's the painting, he said. She understood what he meant without explanation, the 18 months of silence, the excavation he'd described. She nodded. The painting told me before I was ready to hear it. The figure reaching. I kept trying to make the arm reach towards something abstract, toward light, toward freedom, toward a general concept. The arm kept insisting on a direction. He looked at her in Ryan's kitchen in the last evening light coming through the window over the dahlias and felt the full weight of something he'd spent 6 weeks deliberately not putting his full weight on. It held. I'll talk to Ryan this week, he said. She nodded once, the nod of a woman who had said the necessary thing and did not need to ornament it. Good night, Caleb. Good night. He drove home through the Irvington streets and didn't try to think about anything in particular, which was its own kind of answer. Ryan and Jess came back from Florida on a Friday afternoon. By Saturday morning, the house had returned to the operational density of a family of 4, and the quiet week was a different thing entirely. Ryan texted Caleb that evening. Back, thanks for the house, coffee, Sunday morning. Caleb texted back, yes, coffee shop on Division, 8 o'clock. The coffee shop on Division Street was 4 blocks from Caleb's house, a place with good pour-over and uncomfortable chairs that had been there long enough to have earned the right to be unremarkable. Caleb arrived first and ordered 2 coffees and took the corner table and sat with his hands around the mug and his thoughts in the arrangement they'd settled into. Everything weighed correctly, everything in the right place. Ryan walked in, looking like a man who had driven 900 miles round trip in a week and slept for approximately 11 hours across the whole of it. He dropped into the chair across from Caleb and picked up the mug that was waiting for him and drank before he'd fully settled. Jess's mom is fine, he said. She'll be in rehab for the hip another 3 weeks and then insisting on going home, which is insane, but she's also the person who drove herself to the ER with a broken wrist because she didn't want to call an ambulance. He set the mug down. Thank you for looking after the house. It was nothing. Ryan looked at him with the eyes of a man who had been his best friend for 18 years. It wasn't nothing, but that's not why you wanted coffee. Caleb looked at him directly. No. Tell me. I have feelings for Nora. He said it the way he'd decided to say it straight, no architecture around it. Real ones. Not passing, not situational. She has feelings for me. We've been honest with each other about this, and we haven't done anything about it, and we won't do anything about it without talking to you first. He held Ryan's eyes. You're owed this conversation directly from me before anything else happens. Ryan was quiet for long enough that the coffee shop filled in the silence with its ambient noise. The grinder, the low conversation at the counters, the door opening and admitting a couple with a stroller. He looked at the table, then at the window, then back at Caleb. I introduced them, he said. It came out with the weight of something he'd been carrying without putting down. I introduced her to Marcus. I thought I was doing something good. I thought I was reading a situation correctly. He turned his mug in a circle. Jess told me something was off 8 months in. Said Nora seemed smaller when Marcus was around. I told her she was misreading it. His jaw tightened. Jess doesn't misread things. You didn't know what you were looking at? No, but I'm the one who opened the door. He looked up. And now you're sitting across from me asking me how I feel about you and my sister, and part of what I'm feeling is that I owe her a better read this time. His voice was careful and direct. So tell me what I'm looking at. Caleb told him. He told him about the deck in specific terms, what she'd asked, what he'd said, what it had cost him to say it. He told him about the diner and the phone calls and the week of looking after the house. He told him what he'd watched happen over 6 weeks, the return of the painting, the Marcus confrontation, the specific quality of someone recovering their own compass, bearing. He told Ryan the thing he hadn't said out loud yet, that watching Nora return to herself had shown him what was possible beyond just surviving. Ryan listened the way he listened when something mattered completely, without interrupting his expression, cycling through things he didn't try to conceal. When Caleb finished, Ryan was quiet for almost a minute. The night on the deck, he said. You could have said yes. Yes. And you didn't. Because of her. Because it would have hurt her. No hesitation. She was looking for evidence that she wasn't what he'd told her she was. Using me that way would have given her a night and then a morning where she understood exactly how she'd used me, and that understanding would have cost her more than the thing it temporarily addressed. Ryan nodded slowly, the nod of a man doing arithmetic on something important. You know what my father used to say about how you could tell if a man was worth trusting, he said. He said, watch how he behaves when nobody's keeping score. Caleb didn't answer. I've been watching you not keep score for 18 years, Ryan said. You built my deck right when I wasn't there to see it. You fixed my back door because it needed fixing. Not because I asked. You said no to my sister on a dark deck in July when nobody would have known the difference. He picked up his mug. I already know the answer to the question I'm supposed to ask right now. Ask it anyway, Caleb said. You're owed the asking. Are you serious about her not interested, not open to it? Serious. Yes. Ryan drank his coffee and set the mug down and looked at the Division Street foot traffic moving past the window, the Portland Saturday morning sorting itself into joggers and farmers' market bags, and a man walking a dog that had its own opinions about direction. Then he said, open the company first. I'm not kidding about that. You've been the best HVAC tech in this city for 6 years, and you've been acting like a guy who doesn't know it. He turned back to Caleb. And don't hurt her. Not because I'll stop being your friend, I won't, but because she's already been hurt by someone who didn't think carefully enough, and she deserves someone who thinks carefully. He extended his hand across the table. Do we understand each other? Caleb took his hand. We understand each other. And they shook, and it was the handshake of men who have said something permanent and know it and are not frightened by the permanence. Caleb stepped outside to call Nora. The Saturday morning hit him clean and warm the first day of August, asserting itself over the tail end of July, the air carrying the particular smell of Portland in summer river water and coffee in the Douglas firs that grew between every neighborhood in the sky. He called and she answered before the second ring. He said yes. He heard her breath release, not a gasp, just a complete release of something held at pressure for a long time, with conditions, real ones. He wants us to take it slowly and handle things like adults if it doesn't work, and he wants Lily to remain the first consideration. He paused, and he wants me to open the company. Her laugh was short and genuine. Of course he does. He's been saying it for 2 years. He's been right for 2 years. A pause that was different from all the pauses before it opened, rather than restrain the pause of a door that has been unlocked from both sides simultaneously. Come over. He got in the truck and drove to Irvington, and when he turned onto Wisteria Avenue, the morning was doing the thing that Portland mornings did in August, when the weather was cooperating, the light coming through the street maples at an angle that made the ordinary extraordinary, the neighborhood looking like itself, but clarified like a familiar room after all. The windows had been opened at once. Nora was on the front porch with a mug of coffee she'd made for him, not for herself. He came up the porch steps and she handed it to him, and the ordinary domestic precision of this gesture landed in his chest with a force entirely disproportionate to its scale. "Before we talk about logistics," she said, "I need to show you something." The painting was finished. It filled the largest canvas. She had the full image resolved into something that hadn't been visible even 2 days ago. The reaching figure clarified into a specific woman, the arm extended toward a specific hand reaching back from the opposite edge of the canvas. The two hands not yet touching, but in the moment before contact, suspended in the charged half-second before something irrevocable happens. The light that had begun at the edges of every early canvas was now at the center. The dark was still present, at the margins present and honest, but it was no longer the subject. He stood in front of it for a long time. She stood beside him, not speaking, because the painting was saying what needed to be said, and she was wise enough to let it. "The hands don't touch yet," he said. "Not yet." Her voice was quiet, "but they're moving toward each other, and both of them know it." She looked at it alongside him with the satisfaction of something that had told you the truth about itself, that had been what it needed to be rather than what you'd planned for it to be. "It's the best thing you've made," he said. "I know." No false modesty, no deflection. She looked at him. "It's not for sale." The weeks that followed were careful and genuine, and nothing like the relationships that had come before either of them. They moved at the pace of people who had learned something expensive about what moving fast costs. They went to a late showing at living room theaters on S.E. Morrison. They walked the Springwater corridor on a Sunday morning with Lily between them, the 7-year-old conducting a sustained monologue about the migratory patterns of Canada geese, while both adults listened with complete seriousness. They had dinner at Tasty and Daughters and disagreed about the hash brown preparation in a way that was half genuine and entirely enjoyable. Lily met Nora as Caleb's girlfriend on a Saturday in mid-August at the Oregon Zoo, which was Lily's idea because she had recently become interested in the behavior of pack animals and wanted to revisit the wolf exhibit in light of new research she'd read about in a Nat Geo Kids magazine. The meeting was handled without ceremony because that was how Caleb had decided to handle it, and Lily had been informed simply and honestly. At the wolf exhibit, Lily stood at the glass for a long time and then turned to Nora with the full focused attention she gave to things that required expert consultation. "Dad says you can read a room before anyone else in it has figured out there's something to read. Is that true about animals too? Or just buildings?" Nora crouched down to eye level because that was how she talked to Lily. Not condescending, not performing adult-to-child warmth, just at the correct height for a direct conversation. "I think it's the same skill," she said. "You look at how something moves in its space, whether it seems at home, whether the space was designed for it, or whether it's making do." Lily considered this with the seriousness it deserved. "The wolf looks like it's making do," she said. "Yes," Nora said, "it does." They bought ice cream at the cart near the Africa exhibit and walked in the August heat, and Lily held Nora's hand at the intersection of two paths without announcing that she was going to do it, just reaching, and Caleb watched this from slightly behind them and had to stop walking for a moment and look at the trees. On the drive home, Lily fell asleep in the back seat, her regular response to zoo visits and strong emotion, and Nora rode in the passenger seat watching Portland slide past the window. "She doesn't hold hands lightly," Caleb said. "I know." Nora looked at her own hand. "I didn't take it lightly." He glanced at her once quickly and then returned his attention to the road. But she had seen the look, and the look was the kind of thing that didn't require words. September arrived in Portland, the way September arrived gradually, with the light changing first before the temperature followed the angle of the sun dropping in a way that made the shadows longer and more specific. Nora's gallery show opened on the 7th at a small space on Northwest 23rd. She had 11 paintings. They sold 8 in the first 2 hours. Caleb stood in front of the reaching figure, the one marked "not for sale," while the opening moved around him, while Ryan introduced himself to the gallery owner with the sociable energy of a man genuinely proud of his sister, while Jess cried in the corner and pretended she wasn't while Nora's parents arrived. Patricia, her mother, came to stand beside Caleb in front of the not-for-sale painting and looked at it with him. "She called me when she finished this one," Patricia said. 4 in the morning. She called me just to tell me she'd finished it. She looked at it in the way of a woman reading something she'd been waiting years to read, She hadn't painted in 18 months. I know. She told me about the conversation on the deck. Patricia's voice was the voice of a woman who had made her assessments and was not interested in decorating them. What you said to her, what you didn't do. She looked at him with the specific attention of a mother calibrating the difference between that and this. That kind of restraint is rarer than people think. Men who can hold something they want and still choose correctly, that's not a small thing. He didn't know what to say to this, so he said nothing, which she appeared to accept as the correct response. She's been whole before, Patricia said. She knows how. She just needed to remember the route. She looked at the painting one more time. Thank you for not being the detour. Later, when the opening had wound down and only the people genuinely there for the work remained, Nora found him in front of the painting. She came to stand beside him close enough that their shoulders were in contact and neither of them adjusted the distance. My mother talked to you, she said. She did. What did she say? She said you know how to be whole, that you just needed the route. Nora looked at the two hands on the canvas suspended in the moment before contact. She's been saying that to me my whole life, she said, in different words. The first time was when I was 8 and I showed her something I'd painted. She looked at it and said, this knows what it is. Her voice had the quality of someone finally hearing a thing they have known for a long time in the correct key. I think that's what she's always been trying to tell me. Not that I was talented, that I already knew what I was. Do you believe her? He asked. I believe her now. She turned to face him fully without the sideways angle, just directly. She reached out and took his hand, which was the first time he'd done this without the context of transit or navigation, the first time the gesture meant only itself. Her grip was certain. I know, he said. October brought rain in the Portland, way horizontal and consistent, the city's shifting into the long green season. Mason HV ACLLC was incorporated on October 14th, the paperwork filed on a Tuesday afternoon with Ryan as silent partner and an initial service contract with a property management company in the east side that had 17 units and a maintenance backlog that would keep Caleb busy through March. The name on the business cards was simple. He didn't need it to announce anything. The work would do that. He called Nora from the parking lot of the county clerk's office, the signed paperwork in a manila folder on the passenger seat, the rain working the windshield with its reliable Portland intensity. It's done, he said. She was in her own studio by then, a rental space on SE Belmont, with north-facing windows and a freight elevator, the first space that was entirely hers. Come over, she said. I have champagne I've been waiting to open. Champagne for HVAC paperwork. Champagne for a man who built himself something, she said. Come over. He drove across the Morrison Bridge in the rain. The studio smelled like oil paint and the specific cold metallic smell of a Portland October working its way through an old building's windows. She opened the champagne with the efficiency of someone who didn't perform the ceremony of it, and she poured and handed him a glass. To building things that last, she said. To knowing what you're building toward, he answered. They drank. Outside, the rain moved across the city in its patient October way. On the easel behind her, a new painting was in its early stages. He could see the underpainting, the blocked forms that hadn't resolved yet. He didn't ask what it would be. He'd learned that the painting told you what it was becoming when it was ready, not before. The months that followed had the particular texture of a life being rebuilt from good materials, with the correct technique, not without difficulty, not without the days when the work went wrong and had to be redone, but with the underlying soundness of things constructed by people who understood what they were building and why. There was an argument in November about the specific shape of Caleb's tendency to solve problems in isolation, to disappear into the workshop of his own thinking when he was worried about the business, or about Lily, or about the 10,000 things that a man building a company and raising a 7-year-old had to carry simultaneously. Nora named it directly the way she named all structural problems. You go somewhere I can't follow when you're scared, and I need you to know that I can see the door close. He sat with this because it was accurate. He said, I know, I'll work on leaving the door open. They ate takeout Thai on the floor of her studio because she hadn't bought furniture yet, and they talked until midnight, and he drove home through the November rain feeling like a man who had been seen correctly and survived it. Lily asked the question in December on a Sunday at Nora's studio, where she'd been given a corner and some brushes and was painting something she described as a map of where good things happen. She was working with the focused absorption of a person for whom the process was as interesting as the outcome. Is Nora going to live with us? Lily asked, not looking up from the map. Caleb was in the opposite corner. He looked over at Nora, who was at the easel with her back to the room, and he could see from the set of her shoulders that she'd heard and was very deliberately not turning around. That's a conversation for later, bub, he said. Later like tomorrow, or later like a long time. Lily looked up with the pure, pragmatic inquiry of a child who wanted data. Later, like when we're all sure about what we want, and when we've talked about it correctly. He looked at Nora's back. And when we've talked about it correctly. Lily considered this. Then, I think we should. I'm just saying. She went back to the map. July 4th arrived again the way it always arrived, with more ambition than the calendar usually managed, the particular American extravagance of a day that had decided to be significant and organized the weather accordingly. Portland gave them 82 degrees in a clear sky in the specific light of a Pacific Northwest summer evening that had no equivalent anywhere else. Caleb had hung string lights in his backyard in early June, the same type Ryan had hung on Wisteria Avenue a year ago, and they came on at 8:15 as the sky moved through its final colors. Ryan and Jess were there with their kids. Nora was on the porch steps talking to Jess and laughing at something Jess had said, her hair down in the July heat, her hands moving when she talked the way they'd started moving this year. More freely, more in the habit of expression. The fireworks from the waterfront reached them at 9, the sound arriving a beat after the color, the sky above the Woodstock neighborhood catching the light of downtown Portland's celebration and doing something modest but real with it. Lily came running across the yard and stopped in front of both of them with the breathless urgency of a 7-year-old conveying important information. We decided we want to get a trig and name it Deck. Caleb set down the spatula. Deck. Because that's where everything started. Lily delivered this with the certainty of historical fact. Dad told me you were on the deck and then everything happened, so the dog should be Deck. She looked at Nora. Okay. Hey. Nora's eyes went bright in the way they went when something hit her at full force, and she looked at Caleb over Lily's head, and he looked back at her, and the year was in the look, all of it. The July night on the cedar boards, and the diner at 6 in the morning, and the phone calls, and the Marcus confrontation, and the paintings, and Ryan across a coffee shop table shaking his hand, and the studio in October, and the November argument, and the December porch, and everything before and after and between. Deck is a good name, Nora said, her voice carrying the specific quality of a person holding something large very carefully. I vote yes. Lily ran back to report the decision. Caleb picked up the spatula. After a moment, Nora came to stand beside him at the grill, the way she stood close now without the careful measurement of proximity that had characterized the early weeks because there was nothing left to measure carefully. He was working and she was watching the yard where Lily and Ryan's kids were conducting operations that seemed to involve a territory dispute and a set of rules nobody outside the group could have explained, and the string lights were doing their reliable work. Portland was celebrating itself in the middle distance. The fireworks moved through their sequences, each burst opening into the next, the sky doing what it did once a year. Steady, she said quietly enough that it was for him and not for the yard. He knew what she meant. It was what they'd said to each other in variations over the course of a year, the word they'd settled on because it held what needed to be held. Not exciting, not dramatic, not the version of love that burned fast and bright and needed constant oxygen. Steady like a structure built correctly. Steady like hands that knew their work. Steady like a man who did the right thing when nobody was keeping score, and a woman who had returned to herself one brushstroke at a time and found someone worth the return. Steady, he said, the reaching figure, the hands in the moment before contact, the dark still present at the edges, honest and accounted for, the light in the center, not borrowed, not performed, but earned through the slow and unglamorous work of two people who had learned the difference between wanting someone and being ready to choose them, and who had waited for the second thing before honoring the first. Above them, the fireworks finished their work. The lights hung in the yard they were building into a home, and Lily's voice carried across the grass with the authority of someone conducting important operations. And Ryan laughed at something across the yard, and the night settled around them with the particular completeness of things that have been built right. It was enough. It was in every structural sense that mattered exactly enough.